Hey guys. Okay. Today is day 7 of Schindler's List as we continue reading through Rena's memoir and story of her life during the Holocaust and during World War II. Today we're going to read chapter 7, which is titled Schindler's List, so we'll finally figure out who Oskar Schindler is and how he affected Rena's life. Hopefully at the end of chapter 6 you made a good inference that said that he was going to have a positive effect on Rena's experience throughout the Holocaust. And today is actually the last day of this week, of week 2, that we are going to read a chapter. I got a couple of requests when we did the Google form for the poll of what to read next. I got a couple of requests to read a little bit slower throughout the week, so that you guys had a day to kind of catch up in case you missed a day or something. So for tomorrow, or for the next lesson, for day 8, I'm going to upload kind of an extension task where you guys can do some writing. Yay, writing! Okay, but anyway, today we're going to go through day 7 and read chapter 7. Okay? So, today's standard is RI 4.9. So we are still reading informational text. We're looking at 4th grade standards, and we're on the 9th standard, which is actually the very last standard that you'll see in 4th grade. And it is comparing and contrasting. Now, I altered this standard a little bit to make it fit the text that we're reading, and I'll talk to you about that once we get into our other slides. But nonetheless, our I can statement is I can compare and contrast the details and ideas presented in a text. So, mirrors on. I can compare and contrast the details and ideas presented in a text. Mirrors off. Okay, so it's kind of twisted around today. Today, our verbs are really our skill, too, right? Usually we have a verb and then the skill, but today our verbs are really our skills. So what does it mean to compare and contrast? And then I have details in red. What kind of details or ideas presented in an informational text might we compare and contrast? We've done a lot of comparing and contrasting literature this year, but you still have to know how to do that with an informational text, and it is a little bit different. So, let's move on and take a look. Okay, comparing and contrasting. Usually in 4th grade, we do what's called integrating information. That's really what your standard says. The official Louisiana State Standard says I can integrate information from multiple texts. But we're reading one text, and I want to stay focused on that text. I didn't want to bring another text in order to match the standard. I wanted to make the standard match us. So, sometimes, especially in writing, we're asked to compare and contrast two things. And even when you're asked to integrate information from multiple texts, you're often asked to compare and contrast details that were presented in those multiple texts. So when we integrate information, let's talk about that first. So I'm over here on this little guy. We can use information from multiple texts to understand a topic. So we can combine information, we can compare, we can contrast, we can consider information from both or multiple texts that we're reading. Think about on LEAP. A lot of times you're asked to read multiple informational texts that are on similar topics. And then you're asked some multiple choice questions, but then you're also asked to apply it with a writing task where you're asked to compare and contrast texts. You're not usually asked to compare and contrast texts. You're often asked to compare and contrast people or ideas or inventions or events or timelines or causes. All of those different things can be brought into our writing task. So that's really what we're going to focus on today, is really comparing and contrasting two ideas that were presented in this text. We're going to look a little bit at two ideas that were presented in two separate chapters. So let's focus in on comparing and contrasting a little bit. So now I'm over here. When you compare and contrast, you compare, you're telling how two things are alike or the same. And when you contrast, you tell how two things are different. So we often use this little thing down here. Anybody remember what that's called? Some kind of diagram. It's called a Venn diagram. And on the outsides, we put how things are different, and on the inside, we put how things are alike. Now, the main thing that you want to remember when you compare and contrast, and this goes for writing too, when you contrast two things, you have to tell two things. So, sorry guys. So we use the really, really simple example of comparing and contrasting an apple and a banana. If I write on one side, an apple is red, I can't write a banana is long, right? Those don't match up. So when you're comparing and contrasting, you have to make sure that your details that are presented match up, right? A banana is yellow, an apple is red. Those details match up. I'm talking about the color of both. So when you are, it's especially important when you're writing. When you give that evidence about two things, you want to make sure those details talk about something similar. Because you can't tell me that these two things are different because of two details that don't match up, right? That doesn't prove that they're different. So just make sure your details kind of match up when you compare and contrast. All right, Chapter 7. In Chapter 7, we're going to meet Oskar Schindler. He's right here. And we're going to see what's called his sub-camp. So it'll be kind of a separate camp from Plassouf that's that he runs specifically, and we'll see why that's a little bit different. Okay, so the two things that we're going to focus on comparing and contrasting is Amon Get, who we met in Chapter 6, and Oskar Schindler, who we will meet in this chapter. And it will be fairly easy, especially for you guys to contrast them. So I want you to think about the similarities and differences between the two people that we're introduced to, and I want you to also compare and contrast Rena's experiences at the Plassouf camp and then at Schindler's subcamp. And then our quote, which will give you a little bit of insight into what we're going to read about, is he was like a father watching over me and over all the people working for him. So I challenge you to, after we read through this, create a Venn diagram and compare and contrast Amon Get and Oskar Schindler. Then maybe even create another Venn diagram and compare and contrast Rena's experiences at the Plassouf camp and at Schindler's subcamp. Okay? All right, let's go ahead and read. All right, we're looking at Chapter 7, Schindler's List. Oskar Schindler was a handsome German businessman who joined the Nazi Party in 1939. He was never particularly interested in politics. He liked expensive houses, fast cars, and opportunities to make money. After Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, he moved to Krakow, where the German authorities invited him to live in a big apartment previously owned by a Jewish family. Oskar Schindler knew Krakow well. Before the war, he had worked for his father selling farm equipment, and business appointments frequently brought him to the city. Thanks to his contacts in business and government, Schindler received permission in 1940 to take over a factory located in a suburb of Krakow. He renamed his business the German Enamelware Factory, Amalia for short. Hold on. Someone rode by in a bike playing music. And it's gotten louder somehow. Off the street, dude. Okay. Amalia was so close to the Krakow ghetto that Schindler made a deal with the German authorities to have Jews from the ghetto work for him. At first, his reason for wanting Jewish workers was simple. They were cheaper than non-Jewish workers. Nazi policy declared that Jews were less than human, and the German government was happy to send him Jewish workers at a low price. Jewish workers also worked longer and harder than non-Jewish workers, since working meant that they were useful and worth keeping alive. Okay, a little bit of a stretch here, but think for a second about the similarities between this situation and the American Industrial Revolution that we read about. There were people there who were considered less favorable and they got paid a whole lot less, right? Here it's a little bit different. Jews aren't getting paid at all at this point, but we can make a little bit of a connection there. Since Schindler's factory was located near the Krakow ghetto, he had witnessed how badly the Nazis treated Jews. For him, Jewish workers were not just cheap labor, but also human beings, mothers, fathers, and children, who were the innocent victims of Nazi cruelty. The closing of the Krakow ghetto was a problem for Oskar Schindler. He depended on having his workers close by, and now they would be 2 miles away in the Plosshof camp. He had a choice. He could move his factory closer to Plosshof, or he could keep his factory where it was and build a small camp, a sub-camp, where his workers could live. One day he approached Commandant Goethe and explained his idea for building a sub-camp close to the Amalia factory. It's a waste of time for prisoners to walk 2.5 miles from Plosshof, Schindler told Goethe. It makes them tired and less productive. Let me build my own sub-camp where workers can live. They will get to the factory faster each morning. I have orders to fill for the German government, and I need workers in the factory as many hours as possible each day. Besides, it will mean more money for me, and that will also be good for you. Then Schindler slid a bag of diamonds across the table. Goethe put the bribe in his pocket and gave permission for Schindler to build his sub-camp. So really, why did Goethe allow him to build this sub-camp? Did he really believe in Schindler's work? And how did Schindler convince him to allow him, right? And think about their motivations. Why was Schindler doing this, and why was Goethe doing this, right? They both agreed to it, but their reasoning behind that agreement was very different for each of them. Bribes were an important but costly part of Oskar Schindler's business dealings. He was obliged to pay bribes to get permits to build his factory, win contracts from the German government, and maintain good relations with people on the black market who sold his pots and pans. The bribes included watches, cameras, saddles, boots, sports cars, diamonds, and lots of cash. Running a factory was costing him a fortune. This is important to know, because eventually, Schindler decided to spend any available money on bribes to help keep his Jewish workers alive. That is what has earned him such a cherished place, both in the history of the Holocaust and in the hearts of survivors like me. In December 1943, my mother learned that Oskar Schindler needed more prisoners to work in his factory. She sent me to speak with the person who wrote the list of Schindler Jews, meaning those prisoners assigned to work at the Amalia factory, and I begged him to put me and my mother on the list. This person once shared our apartment in the Krakow ghetto and may have felt an obligation toward us. He put our names on the list, and that's how my mother and I became Schindler Jews. Soon after getting on the list, we moved into the Amalia subcamp. The entrance to Schindler's factory was a wide metal gate. Inside the gate were 2 buildings. In one building, workers manufactured metal pots and pans that were then dipped in hot enamel and dried. In the other building, workers made armaments for the German army, mostly shell casings polished by hand. Past these 2 buildings was the subcamp, with watchtowers for the German guards, a kitchen, washrooms, a food storage warehouse, offices, and barracks. The first time I saw Oskar Schindler, he was smoking a cigarette and wearing an expensive suit. There was a diamond swastika on his lapel. The swastika was the sign of Nazi Germany, so for Jews it was the symbol of destruction and death. At that time I didn't know much about him, just that he was a powerful person. But I learned that we had no need to be afraid of him. There aren't enough words to describe Oscar's kindness to his workers. To protect us, he made sure no Nazi guards entered the factory without his permission. He purchased food for us on the black market. This meant we ate better and stayed healthier than less fortunate Jews in concentration camps who were given nothing but rotten soup. While millions of Jews were being murdered elsewhere, the Jews working for Oskar Schindler survived. We had medicine when we were sick, water and soap to stay clean, and decent food to eat. Each evening, Oskar announced that he needed some younger prisoners to clean his office. A group of us younger people would go to his office, lie down under the desks, and fall asleep. Oskar didn't really need help cleaning his office. It was a tactic, a way of providing his younger workers with an excuse for refreshing themselves with a good night's sleep. I admired Oskar as he walked through his factory and stopped to talk with his workers, calling them by name. He left half-smoked cigarettes at various stations, pretending he forgot them, when actually he was leaving them for men who had a smoking habit. I remember saying to myself, God has sent an angel to save us. We were still prisoners. We still worked long, hard days. And we were still hated by the Nazis. But for those of us lucky enough to work for Oskar, the Amalia factory was paradise. The factory operated round the clock, 24 hours a day. We worked in 12-hour shifts. Some of the adults carried and worked with heavy metal supplies and other industrial materials, which was too dangerous for a 13-year-old like me. Instead, I worked on a little machine that made small caliber bullet shells. The grown-ups worked on bigger machines that made larger shells. Operating these bigger machines involved pushing a heavy lever up and down. Everyone had trouble with that lever, which was always breaking. One day, the factory foreman took me off my little machine and put me to work on one of the bigger machines. Right away, it broke. The foreman came over and expressed anger over the breakdown. "You did this on purpose," he yelled. "I'm going to get a guard to shoot you." Although I knew Oskar never allowed German guards to enter the factory unattended, let alone shoot anyone, I was terrified. One of the other workers ran to Oskar and told him what was going on. He came down from his office to the factory floor. "What happened?" he asked. The foreman pointed at me and insisted I had broken the machine on purpose. Oskar looked at little me, then at that big machine. "Don't ever put a little girl to work on such a big machine," he told the foreman. "Only men are allowed to work on that machine." I was crying from fear. Oskar patted me on the head and said, "Don't worry. Where were you working before?" I showed him the smaller machine. "That is where he should work," he instructed the foreman, "and that's where she should stay." After that, whenever Oskar toured his factory, he stopped by my spot and asked, "How are you doing, little one?" He was like a father watching over me, and over all the people working for him. Then, everything went terribly wrong. Okay, so you guessed it, we are thinking about the differences and the similarities, there are a couple out there, between Oskar Schindler and Amon Get. What's similar about them and what's different, and what is similar and different. Try to compare and contrast Rena's experiences in Poissuf and Rena's experiences in Oscar's subcamp. So that will prepare you for our little extension task that we will get into in our next lesson on day 8. Alright, kiddos, go and draw up some Venn diagrams and see if you can compare and contrast those things that we talked about today. Alright, love you, miss you, mean it. See you for day 8.